We will get. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site's Fourth Tuesday Speaker Night. My name is Lenora Henson, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site. I'm joined behind the scenes by Travis Ratka, who's our programming assistant. And I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. As you know, we are Western New York's only national park site. And although we are actually managed on a daily basis by a local foundation that is also responsible for raising nearly $500,000 each year to keep our doors open. In that vein, I want to say a special thank you to our TR site members who are with us today. Your support is always appreciated, but even more so as we continue to navigate our way through the pandemic and adapt to circumstances that seem to change on a regular basis. The Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site's monthly speaker night series is our opportunity to invite experts to help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. We couldn't do this without the generous financial support of our series sponsors, so our thanks go out to Erie County and the New York State Council on the Arts. As you all know, NYSCA support has enabled us to record nearly all of our speakers for the past 4 or 5 years. I've lost track. But if you've missed any of them, I encourage you to check out the recordings on our new YouTube channel. We are lucky to have Ryan Swanson here with us this evening. He is an associate professor of history at the University of New Mexico, where he also serves as the director of the Lobo Scholars Program, an innovative initiative that serves NCAA Division I student athletes. He earned a PhD in history from Georgetown in 2008 and has been studying and researching Theodore Roosevelt and his role in athletics in the United States for more than 10 years. He's the author of When Baseball Went White, Reconstruction, Reconciliation, and Dreams of a National Pastime, which won the 2015 Society for American Baseball Research Award, and Separate Games, African-American Sport Behind the Walls of Segregation, which received the North American Society for Sport History Book Prize in 2017. His newest book, The Strenuous Life, Theodore Roosevelt and the Making of the American Athlete, came out in August of 2019, and that's what he's here to talk to us about this evening. So having said that, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Ryan Swanson, and I'm going to turn things over to you. Thank you for being here.
All right, thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here. See. Okay. Can everybody see that okay and hear me okay? Good on that front?
If anyone has any questions or problems, just either chat or drop things into the chat, or also the Q&A is another way to reach out to Travis and me.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you to Lenora and the TR Inaugural Site for this invitation. And let me give you my greetings from New Mexico, from the land of enchantment. We're just kind of experiencing the first bit of fall here, you know, and so we are looking forward. We don't have the beautiful changing leaves, perhaps like you all are experiencing in your part of the country, but we are just days away from the balloon fiesta, which is kind of our big tourist event where we have hundreds of hot air balloons kind of in the sky at all times for a couple of weeks, which is really beautiful and inevitably leads to some fender benders as people are watching the balloons instead of their driving. But that is not what I'm going to talk about tonight. Tonight, I want to talk about two interrelated stories. I want to talk about Theodore Roosevelt as an athlete, and I want to talk about the rise of sports in the United States. The key question behind this book, behind this project for me, was how did we get this way in the United States in terms of sports? And so to try to answer that question, I'm going to have us kind of bounce back and forth between those two topics I mentioned. We're going to talk about TR as an athlete, and then we'll talk about the rise of sports so we can kind of get at this question. So let's start with Teddy Roosevelt first. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858, as I'm sure many of you know. He was born in New York City, And he was born into a nation on the cusp of war. The Civil War was right around the corner. But it was good to be a Roosevelt in the 1850s. His family was wealthy. They had their, kind of financial fingers in all kinds of things. But the family had significant holdings in the glass industry and in real estate, among other things, in New York City. The family traveled extensively to Europe, to the Middle East. The family was politically and socially connected, well respected in New York City. In terms of Roosevelt as a child, he was precocious. He was smart. He was a reader. He was a writer. One interesting habit that he had that's very different, for example, from what I see from my kids, is, he was really interested in nature to the point where he often, tried to link up, that insect or bird or animal that he saw outside. He worked to know the Latin scientific terms for those animals. So in many ways, Roosevelt would have had the ideal childhood, except for the fact that he had terrible asthma. From what we know, asthma kind of onset in young Theodore Roosevelt's life around age 3. And as you think about this asthma that he had, I would caution you, or I often caution my students, for example, not to think of it, in the same vein as you might think about that classmate you remember back in elementary school, or even yourself back in elementary school, where, you'd have to take a break from the PE class and kind of get a pull on that albuterol inhaler, and then you could jump back into things. Not that that's not significant, but for Roosevelt, it was much more than that. For Roosevelt, asthma was a crisis on a kind of hourly, daily basis. And making this situation, this asthma situation that he experienced even more, I think, severe was the fact that at this time, the understanding of asthma was pretty rudimentary. A book comes out in 1864, which you can see here, which kind of moves forward the research on asthma. But among the things it says is that asthma is both a physical and a mental condition. And it really even kind of pushes it further than that and kind of hints that children, especially who suffer from asthma, might have character flaws or even almost kind of a spiritual flaw. And so the idea is that many children who have asthma use the condition or use some version of the condition as a way to get out of things. I don't want to go to school. I don't want to go to church. I have asthma. And so for Roosevelt, that kind of, not only does he have to struggle with the asthma itself, but he kind of has to struggle with being labeled as a child who has asthma. Now, the Roosevelt family had a lot of means at their disposal, so they tried everything they could to get some help for their son in this struggle against asthma. The problem is the research and the medicine wasn't very good at this time. Inhalers, albuterol inhalers, which I already mentioned, they don't come along until the 1950s, really. And so at this time, all kinds of things are tried to try to get around asthma or to get some relief from asthma. During the time between his, he's about 3 and the onset of puberty, the family tries having him ingest Ipecac. They have him undergo bloodletting. They subject young TD, as they called him, to bloodletting. As a 7-year-old, they had him smoking cigars and drinking coffee. Sometimes, things got so bad that in the middle of the night, his father would take him out and young Roosevelt would go out into the January, kind of icy air, the thinking being that those cold temperatures would somehow kind of ease things that were going on in his lungs. And so, it was a really difficult experience for Roosevelt. Interestingly enough, the family decided, and Roosevelt thought, that coffee with its caffeine stimulant gave as much relief as anything, which was not that much relief at all. So this is the formative experience in young Roosevelt's life. It's terrible for the whole family to a certain extent. Roosevelt's condition is so extreme that he cannot go to school. Oftentimes he's pulled out of school and the family gets him an individual tutor. He can't spend much time outside. His condition actually curtails the traveling. They're able to do some, but oftentimes they have to cut things short, because they have to worry about, how Roosevelt's going to be able to breathe. And so things kind of reach ahead when Roosevelt is about 13 years old. And he remembers at this point his father calling him into his wood paneled study for a heart-to-heart. And at that point, Roosevelt's father says to him, kind of on the positive side, "I'm proud of you, son. He's proud of the young man that Roosevelt is. He's certainly proud of his intellectual development, his quest for knowledge. But he says to Roosevelt, something has to change. He says to Roosevelt, to paraphrase, you have the mind, but you have to make your body. And he kind of throws it onto Roosevelt, who's on the cusp of adolescence here, and says, enough's enough. The family can't live this way anymore. You have to solve this asthma issue. Now, I'm a father of three, and this doesn't strike me as all that fair, right? Fix your asthma problem is basically what he's saying. But Roosevelt kind of thinks about it for a moment. His sister is there as well, and she remembers this moment later in life. And incidentally, Roosevelt loves to tell this story as he, is in the presidency and things like that. So he thinks about this challenge his father has given him. He pauses for a minute, and then he throws his head back. He remembers, and his sister remembers, and he says, okay, I'll make my body. And so that was that. And this is the beginning of this change that we'll see in Roosevelt. Now, hold on to that image here, if you will, kind of Roosevelt, sickly child struggling with asthma, who's given this challenge by his father to build up his body. Hold on to that for a minute, and let me flip back to the other side. Let me flip back to the development of youth sports. How did we get this, or excuse me, of sports? How did we get this way? So, a lot of people have asked me, what leads someone to write a book about Theodore Roosevelt and sports? And it's a fair question, right? It's not the most immediately obvious topic. But for me, it kind of goes back to some of the youth games I have sat on the sidelines of here with my own children. And so the picture here you can see is of my oldest son a few years ago playing in a Little League baseball game here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And actually, interestingly enough, in this image here, you can see in the background is a building, and that's actually a General Mills cereal factory that's right past, kind of the outfield fence. And so it's a strange situation at these games because you have your kids playing, you're watching baseball, but over you kind of wafts this smell of Captain Crunch. At least that's what I think it is. This sweet sugar smelling, kind of situation. So one time there, though, we were at a game a while back, and my son Carter was actually playing out in the outfield, and it is freezing cold. In terms of our springs here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, we're at 5,000 feet. And so the weather in the spring is really unpredictable. It kind of rises up into the 70s and 80s, and then it can drop back down into the 30s. And wind is the major enemy in spring in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we're at this game, Carter's in the outfield. The wind is roaring in basically directly from center field. It's blowing all this dust into the face of the players and the parents. I wear contact lenses. I basically can't see. I'm like covering my eyes. And the kids are all freezing out here. And so my son's out in the outfield, and he actually starts doing jumping jacks during the game, trying to stay warm. And, to me, this doesn't seem like a bad solution. This is Little League baseball. The chance of a ball actually coming to him in the outfield is pretty slim. So he's trying to stay warm. He's doing jumping jacks. And out of nowhere, the ump kind of comes out from behind the home plate, throws off his mask, and yells out into the outfield, hey, you out there, no jumping jacks in the outfield, no jumping jacks in baseball. And it's kind of at this point, as my son is experiencing this, I could see his lip trembling, kind of tears, he's embarrassed going on. There's a part of me that thinks, why are we doing this? What is going on here? And that's really the core question that's at the root of this book. Why do we think that youth sports are good for our kids? Why do we mix education and sports in the way that we do in the United States? Why do we organize our calendar around sporting events? You've got the Fall Classic, the World Series, you've got the Super Bowl. Why do we say things like us when we're talking about our favorite team? I'm a Denver Broncos team. Sometimes I fall into that trap. Oh, we had a bad week, or, those kinds of things. Why do we obsess over spectator sports when as a nation we're continuing to grow more and more unhealthy and obese? So these are the kinds of questions that are at the root of this study. And you might think, okay, I get there's this. So you're interested in how sports kind of developed in the United States. What's that have to do with Roosevelt? Well, one of the ways to answer this question I found as I dug in and began researching was to look back and try to figure out when these trends and when these institutions started. And what I found was that many of the organizations and traditions and norms that we take for granted in terms of sports go back to the beginning of the 20th century. And they go back to when Theodore Roosevelt himself was in the White House. So let's flip back now. to Roosevelt. So if you remember, we left off, Roosevelt was in that wood paneled office with his father. He throws back his head, and he says, "I will do it. I will make my body." And so beginning at that point, Theodore Roosevelt in his early teens throws himself into physical fitness, into athletics, into sports. And he does this in a way that you would kind of expect a rich kid to do it. His father builds him basically a gymnasium in their New York City home. He hires several professional boxers to train young Roosevelt. But nevertheless, this may be a very kind of bourgeois way to go about this, but nevertheless, Roosevelt begins putting in the time, doing everything he can to try to build up his body. He hits the heavy bag, he does push-ups, he starts running, he starts sparring, and slowly but steadily, Roosevelt starts to see some progress. He starts to kind of emerge out of this kind of crisis period of asthma, and kind of begin to see himself as able to do some things physically. Now, this is not a kind of straightforward linear process. In many cases, it's Roosevelt feeling good about himself one day when he goes to the gym and maybe can lift a few weights. But then the next day, he recounts in his autobiography that as he's going through this process, at one point, he's bullied on a train ride. And if this isn't bad enough, what he says about the bullies is they kind of tortured him without worrying that he could even fight back. So he was kind of that weak. He wasn't even deemed a threat at this point. But nevertheless, over this, kind of in his year, when he's 13, 14, 15, Roosevelt works hard at improving his physical fitness. And, in this time, as he's reaching kind of his middle teen years, he has a significant breakthrough. Basically, in his gym, his trainer enters him into a boxing competition. It's a really poor field. And Roosevelt, kind of through a matter of the draw and everything like this, ends up winning a small pewter trophy for winning this kind of really low stakes boxing tournament. And for Roosevelt, it means everything. He starts to see himself in a different way. And here's what Roosevelt says about this trophy. And I find this to be, kind of sympathetic. And you can read here what he said. "I kept it and alluded to it, and I fear bragged about it for a number of years. And I only wish I knew where it was now. Years later," he says, "I read an account of a little man who once in a fifth-rate handicap race won a worthless pewter medal and joyed in it ever after. Well, as I read that story, I felt that that man and I were brothers. This was, as far as I remember," Roosevelt says, "the only one of my exceedingly rare triumphs which would be worth relating." And can't we all kind of relate to this, in some way? We've got that victory, we've got that triumph, which means a lot for us personally, but in the world's eyes doesn't mean, very much at all. But, Roosevelt continues forward. Whoops, we won't go to that quite yet. Roosevelt continues with this physical fitness evolution, and gradually a miracle almost begins to happen. What Roosevelt discovers is the more that he exercises and continues in this training process, the less that asthma really kind of affects him. And so over the course of time, Roosevelt comes to believe that he has healed himself. He exercised, he put in a lot of work, and this asthma, which had tortured him for a decade, really kind of fades into the background. And Roosevelt makes the connection in his brain, and I think we all would do the same, that because of the effort he put in, the asthma went away. And this connection that he makes will be important as he goes into his political career and thinks about what sports can be for the nation. Now, Roosevelt here sees a causal relationship. Exercise cured weakness, or exercise cured asthma. But correlation and causation are usually not as simple as we want to make them. And as one example of this, and this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Roosevelt, there's a scholar out there, Tyler Vehan, who wrote a book called Spurious Correlations. And actually, I believe he was a law student at Harvard when he began digging into data. And basically what, this author found was that if you want to, you can dig into the data and find out that all kinds of patterns seem to be matching each other that don't necessarily have strong correlations. And so here I put one up here, as you can see from the data, and he's basically using government data to do these kinds of things. He found that really, if you look at the data, the divorce rate in Maine seems to track almost exactly with the per capita consumption of margarine, right? As we might all expect. Similarly, he finds that the number of people who drown by falling into a swimming pool seems to line up really closely with the films that Nicolas Cage appeared in. Now, what this work shows is that simply because two things seem to mirror each other doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal relationship, doesn't mean that there's correlation. And in the case of Roosevelt, I think this is worth mentioning because what Roosevelt does is he assumes that the data seems to match up and therefore that one has caused the other. Exercise and sport and athletics has cured a weakness. And Roosevelt will kind of lock this in, as we do with many kind of conclusions that perhaps we come to during our teen years. He locks it in and really carries this forward for the rest of his life. And he will believe that sports and athletics can cure what ails him. And he will believe the same kind of holds true for the nation, that athletics can cure what ails one. And this we will see throughout the rest of his life. So Roosevelt, having kind of moved forward a little bit physically, or quite a bit physically, heads off to Harvard for his university time. He arrives in 1876. And if you look through the records, and Harvard has a wonderful Roosevelt collection, if you look through the records, what you see with Roosevelt at Harvard is basically he tries to make up for lost time. You know, this boy who wasn't able to go to school regularly as a child, who couldn't play sports, who couldn't spend much time outside athletically, gets to college and feels like he needs to join everything, every group, every committee. Basically, he's the guy in the back always saying, yes, me, I join, I'll volunteer, I'm in. And so kind of in modern vernacular, maybe you've heard the term FOMO, fear of missing out. Roosevelt has an extreme case of FOMO at Harvard. So he joins everything that he can. Now, in terms of athletics, Roosevelt is not kind of up to the level necessary to, say, play football at Harvard, which is really becoming popular at this time. He also can't make the crew team. He's not good enough to do that. But what Roosevelt does do is commit further to a physical training program. He goes to the gymnasium most every day and pounds away at the heavy bag, spars anyone who will enter the ring with him, and continues to work to make himself a stronger man physically. And you can see him here on the left, you know, he, in terms of stature, he's not very big, but you can see from his calves and his arms, you know, the working out is starting to pay off, and he's getting stronger. Now, interestingly enough, while he's at Harvard, Roosevelt, as is the case with all Harvard undergraduates, has to be examined by a physical education professor at the school before he can graduate. Physical education is kind of a new thing at this time. Hiring someone to teach physical education is really new, but Harvard's kind of on the cutting edge in this way, and they hire somebody named Dudley Sargent to kind of pay attention to what their students need in terms of physical growth, in terms of athletics. And Dudley Sargent, evaluates Theodore Roosevelt. He comes in, he measures him, he asks him about his background. And long story short, right as Roosevelt's about to graduate from Harvard, Dudley Sargent kind of calls him into his office and tells him, because of the damage done by asthma, because of his family history, Roosevelt actually should give up exercise altogether. Basically, he tells him you need to live a calm, sedentary life, or you're at risk of early heart attack or stroke or something like that. Now, just to be clear, Sargent's medical reasoning for this is pretty suspect as we look at it today. But this is the information he gives. This is kind of the research at the time. He turns this over to Roosevelt, who considers it for a minute and basically says, I'm not listening to this at all. He says, I'd rather live a short life than one that isn't one that has strenuous activity involved in it. So Roosevelt uses the remainder of his time at Harvard to both blossom socially, to kind of consider, new ideas and intellectual growth. But he's also, really fastidious about, kind of continuing to prove athletically. And so Roosevelt keeps a notebook of all of his exercises, all of his sparring matches, and he regularly measures himself to see if he's got any improvement here. So I think you could argue that we see in Roosevelt a fair amount of self-absorption at this point, but he's very much taking it serious, kind of, in a way that harkens back to his scientific bent as a child. He's trying to do everything he can to make sure that he is growing physically stronger, that he's becoming some sort of athlete, even if he, will never be able to compete, say, for example, at the intercollegiate level. So Roosevelt graduates from Harvard in 1880. He becomes engaged just before he graduates to Alice Lee. They are married right at graduation time. They are blissfully happy, but only for a couple of years when Alice dies in childbirth, just a couple of years into their marriage. And famously, you might have heard this, Roosevelt's wife and mother die on the same day. And so Roosevelt's upbringing, which had been asthma, yes, but then he kind of overcomes it. He gets this Harvard education. Things seem to really kind of be going well. Grief enters into his life, certainly with the loss of his first wife. He has a baby daughter who he kind of turns over to his sister. And as you may have heard, Roosevelt goes at this point out to the Dakota territories for a period of horseback riding and building and kind of rough living. I wouldn't call it athletics, but the idea here again for Roosevelt is, all right, I've got something facing me. It's not asthma this time, it's grief. And he turns to the physical realm to try to find comfort for that. And incidentally, this is today where the Theodore Roosevelt National Park is. It's where they're building a presidential library in the kind of Dickinson, North Dakota area. But this is part of Roosevelt's development as well. Roosevelt remarries just a couple of years after losing Alice. He marries Edith, a childhood friend. The two of them have 5 additional children. And from here, Roosevelt kind of moves into his public life. Roosevelt tries for a short time law school. He doesn't really like it. He's then elected to the New York State Legislature. He spends some time in Albany, which he does not really enjoy. But from there, he holds a series of kind of ever ascending political positions. He's, among other things, he's the police commissioner of New York City. He's the assistant secretary of the Navy. But then really, if you fast forward a bit until 1898, it's really the Spanish-American War where Roosevelt kind of fully comes into his own. He's the assistant secretary of the Navy at this time, and he says there's no way he's missing this glorious conflict. And Roosevelt very much sees war and violence in kind of this romantic way. So nevertheless, he goes and has this experience. It's really only about 4 months, the Rough Riders. Interestingly enough, Roosevelt's in charge of raising up this regiment, and he kind of picks 2 types of men primarily. He picks people from the Southwest. So me being here from New Mexico, there's a Rough Rider Museum here in Las Vegas, New Mexico, kind of trumpeting that a little bit. But then also Roosevelt fills the Rough Riders with former college athletes. If you go through the roster, there's quarterbacks and rowers and pitchers, kind of one after another. And so Roosevelt, is kind of already laying out this design of athletics playing a role in development. So from there, Roosevelt kind of rises like a rocket, as it said. Roosevelt comes back from the Spanish-American War a hero. He's quickly elected governor of the state of New York, despite the fact he's not living in New York at the time, which is a bit of a problem, but that doesn't stand in his way. And he becomes really the nation's foremost, or one of the nation's most foremost politicians. And he's invited in 1899 to give a speech in Chicago. So he's the governor of New York at this point. He's a war hero. He's got this kind of up by his bootstraps story in terms of his physical well-being, certainly not in terms of economics. He's invited to give a speech in 1899 in Chicago. He goes there, it's a cold April day, and he gives what becomes known as the Strenuous Life speech. And you can see part of it here. I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life, the life of toil and effort, of labor and strife. And on it goes from there. Now, interestingly enough, this speech Roosevelt gives is primarily kind of this imperial version of American conquest. The world is, as Roosevelt sees it, is kind of on the cusp. America is standing on the precipice. Will it become a world power? Will it somehow be pushed into the background? That's what Roosevelt is talking about primarily in this Strenuous Life speech. But once he utters these words, once he kind of puts this idea out there, he basically loses control of the strenuous life in some ways. And the concept of strenuous life very much becomes linked together with athletics in the United States. And so Roosevelt gives this speech, it kind of goes into the public consciousness, and then it becomes connected with athletics, as does Roosevelt. And so the strenuous life becomes kind of a tagline, yes, associated with Roosevelt, but also very much with athletics. So kind of pushing forward here, I'm kind of keeping an eye on the clock as we talk. So I'd be glad to entertain any questions at the end. Roosevelt becomes president, as this group knows more than any other. In 1901, following the assassination of McKinley, Roosevelt assumes the presidency in 1901. One of the first public outings that Roosevelt has, just a couple of months later, is that he attends the Army-Navy football game on November 1st, 1901. And what's interesting about this is that Roosevelt, in making this public appearance, kind of begins his recasting of the US presidency. The big question people have at this, kind of Roosevelt traveling to Philadelphia, going to the Army-Navy game, being in this very public setting, is this proper? Is this safe for a president, right? Roosevelt not only goes to the game himself, he basically brings his whole cabinet. He comes in this very public way. He kind of, romps into Philadelphia's Franklin Field, great pomp and circumstance. And he casts this vision of connecting the president to a football game, for example. At halftime, Roosevelt starts the side on the Navy side. At halftime, he switches over to the Army side. This footage is available. I'm not going to play it just because of bandwidth issues. I don't want to get all caught up here, but Roosevelt attends the Army-Navy game. One of the first things he does, and the nation's newspapers kind of go wild over this specter. Look at this new kind of president, they say. He's going to football games. They watch the fact that during the game, the press are kind of gathered around him as the game goes on. And Roosevelt is jumping up, he's cheering, he's basically calling for blood, in terms of the defense. And about midway through the second half of the game, Roosevelt basically jumps out of his seat, runs down on the sidelines of the Navy football team, and begins like slapping guys on the back, kind of rallying them, to get going. And this is pretty significant in terms of maybe reconceptualizing what the president is supposed to act like. And from here, Roosevelt begins establishing a connection between the US presidency and the sporting evolution that's going on in the country. So, if that's what's going on with Roosevelt, consider some of the other things that happened during his presidency, which are not directly connected to him. I think one mistake that we could make here is to somehow say that Roosevelt created this sports revolution. He didn't. He was part of it. He talked about it. He supported it. But a lot of it is going on kind of outside of his control as well. But the confluence of those two things, Roosevelt projecting this athletic image, these new events and organization rising up, the fact that you've got kind of these multiple strains moving in one direction makes it a really formative time for US sports. So what kinds of things are going on? This is a picture here in 1903 of the first World Series. The first World Series takes place in 1903, between teams from Boston and Pittsburgh. And this is really the beginning of Major League Baseball emerging into a national commercial entity. And the World Series is just one of many sports developments that happens during Roosevelt's presidency. Among other things, in 1903, that same year, the Public Schools Athletic League is formed in New York City. The next year, in 1904, for the first time, the United States hosts the Olympic Games. They host it in St. Louis. Originally, actually, just as a side note, originally the games are awarded by what is now the IOC to Chicago. But, long story short, St. Louis is already slated to hold the World's Fair in 1904. And so they kind of steal away the Olympic Games from Chicago. They're held in St. Louis in conjunction with this big World's Fair celebration, which is also a celebration of the Louisiana Purchase. And the United States kind of co-opts the Olympic Games and turns it into this kind of nationalist celebration. And I think this foreshadows the United States relationship with the Olympic Games going forward. For the United States, always the Olympic Games will be a way to prove how great the nation is. And so this kind of has roots in the Roosevelt era. Also during this time, college football really booms in terms of its popularity. The NCAA, which its highest award now is named after Theodore Roosevelt. The NCAA is established in 1906. So all of these things are going on as Roosevelt is kind of projecting this new image of what it means to be a strenuous president. And so, the key question here, though, I think for us is, what does this have to do with Roosevelt? And that really depends. I mean, Roosevelt throws his support, and he's a very popular president for the vast majority of his presidency. He throws his support behind the Olympic Games. He really throws his support behind the Public Schools Athletic League. He gets involved in football, but actually Roosevelt is not a baseball fan. So, I mean, it's not like he's just kind of pushing this whole thing forward. But as much as anything, what Roosevelt does is he creates a culture in which these athletic events and kind of trends make sense. Roosevelt has ideas about everything, as perhaps you have heard. He likes to talk about many different kinds of things. And so as you know, the nation is learning about what Roosevelt values, they hear him talk about athletics all the time. Roosevelt talks about the hikes he's taken, the games he's attended, what his children are doing, kind of on down the line it goes. So Roosevelt is creating this culture in which athletics fit. And let me step back here just for a moment and talk just briefly, kind of give you a little bit of additional context about what's going on in the nation at this time. Plenty's going on, obviously. The assassination of McKinley rattles the country in some pretty significant ways. But if you kind of step back even more broadly than that, the turn of the 20th century is really the time when, you know, urbanization and industrialization have won the day. So more than half of Americans are living in cities at this point. Most Americans are now taking jobs as employees, many of them in factories, and so that's a big change. And the nation as a whole is kind of experiencing these big changes and looking around and asking, is this what we want? Cities are fascinating places with great opportunities, but they're also very dangerous places. They're filled with germs, they're filled with disease, there's not enough fresh air, there's not enough open space. And so as the nation is kind of dealing with this change towards industrialization, towards urbanization, sports become one of the answers that progressive reformers see as a way to make sense of this new modern world. And so Roosevelt is a big part of this. And Roosevelt in the White House is an athlete. And he is that in a couple of different ways. Perhaps most visibly, Roosevelt has a tennis court installed right outside of the executive office. It's actually where the Oval Office is today when he moves into the White House. And this tennis court becomes kind of a cultural touchstone of athletics or for athletics in the country. And basically, you know, what happens is Roosevelt, when he moves into the White House as a whole is badly in need of repair. And so Roosevelt is able to secure from Congress about $600,000 to do some much needed renovations to the White House as a whole. But also at that time, a tennis court is put in just outside of his office. And the tennis court becomes part of Roosevelt's scene, and newspapermen begin reporting on these tennis matches that Roosevelt had. And the way that it played out was Roosevelt had some regular players, yes, but any visitor to the White House was at risk of being asked to join the president in a game of tennis. And these games took place in all weather, the brutal cold of January and the suffocating heat of August. And Roosevelt was known, to play in the snow. He was known to play when the court was frozen. And so this becomes kind of, a new example of what it means to be a politician in the country. People begin to say, if the president has time to play 3 sets of tennis on an August day, so do you. And so athletics begins to be seen as part of perhaps the American workday. Roosevelt, gathers around himself, actually, let me skip forward and see. Roosevelt gathers around himself a group of advisors who become known as the tennis cabinet. These are basically, there's about 35 men, many, most of them holding positions in Washington, D.C., either directly or indirectly connected to the government. Most of them are younger than Roosevelt by, 5 or 10 years. And these are the men who respond when Roosevelt's looking for somebody to exercise with. So Roosevelt kind of, he will have worked the morning, it's mid-afternoon, he's got a hankering for some tennis. Who can he ask? This tennis cabinet becomes the answer to that question. So Roosevelt will, on an almost daily basis, look for somebody to play tennis with, to toss around the medicine ball with, or he begins, he's very fond of point-to-point walks, he calls them. And so if I go back here, Roosevelt is fond of this idea of what he calls the point-to-point walk. And the idea here is pretty simple. The idea is that the president will have the Secret Service drop him off, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 miles away from the White House. And he and his, whoever's along with him for this walk will try to go in a straight line back through through the wilderness, through Rock Creek Park, up and over, granite cliffs and through rivers. They'll try to go in a straight line back to the White House. Oftentimes, Roosevelt will encourage them to jog and see how fast they can do it. And so in a way, Roosevelt's kind of cross-country extreme trail running becomes, another marker of athleticism for the White House. Stories of Roosevelt as an athlete really start to kind of move into public consciousness. There's one story in particular of him on one of these strenuous hikes that gets a lot of play. One of Roosevelt's favorite kind of athletic compatriots is Jules Jusserand, who you see there on the right. He's the secretary or the ambassador, for France in the United States. Roosevelt and Jusserand and a couple of other Washington men set out one day on one of these point-to-point hikes. On this particular day, Roosevelt has the Secret Service drop him and his friends off about 5 miles from the White House, and then they go on one of these strenuous walks. They come about halfway through across the Potomac River, or up to the Potomac River. And it's at this point that Roosevelt has a great idea. He often has great ideas on these. He's enthusiastic, and he basically says, what a perfect time for a swim. And so Roosevelt and Jusserand, the president of the United States, the ambassador of France, and several other Washington insiders, important people, strip naked and go into the Potomac for a swim. Famously, though, Jusserand didn't take off his gloves that he was wearing. And so Roosevelt yells over to Jusserand, hey, you forgot to take your gloves off. And Jusserand, who has a great understanding of kind of Roosevelt's enthusiasm and how all of this is a little bit crazy, calls back to the president and says, I'm keeping them on. We might see some ladies, so he's going to still hold on to his diplomatic means. So Roosevelt is, again, kind of creating this different kind of presidency. The tennis cabinet is a big part of that. One other big part, and I'll kind of move towards the conclusion here, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions people have. Perhaps, the most wide-reaching of the changes that Roosevelt supports is the establishment of interscholastic sports. In 1903, in New York City, a gentleman by the name of Luther Gulick establishes the Public Schools Athletic League. And Gulick has two primary goals. He wants to increase participation. He wants more children being athletic. He wants more children playing sports. And he wants to establish kind of interscholastic or inter-school competition. So he wants to have championships and he wants to have participation. And so Gulick goes about, chasing after this big, ambitious idea in a bunch of different ways. One of the first things he does is reaches out to the White House and asks President Roosevelt to be an honorary president of the PSAL. Roosevelt immediately signs on at the beginning and will provide support kind of moving forward. In addition to that, Gulick supports the beginning of what will become the Presidential Fitness Testing Award. At this time, the idea is that you want children to try to reach certain athletic benchmarks. And this, if you're of a certain age, probably sounds familiar. When I was in elementary school, for example, we did the Presidential Fitness Test. And this is kind of the way that this Gulick idea kind of moved forward into the 1980s and 1990s. And the idea is that you have boys and girls line up and say, run a mile, try to do some pull-ups, do a shuttle run, do several of these different things. And if they can reach a certain benchmark, they are given a certificate saying, they have won the Presidential Fitness Award. This type of broad scale connection of athletics and education with the president's support has huge ramifications for the United States. If you think about our sports in the United States today, one of the really unique things is how our schools, especially our high schools and our colleges, are connected to sports. This is really different than, for example, the way that most of the rest of the world does it. And it has roots here in this period when Roosevelt is president. Now, in 2012, President Obama did away with the presidential fitness testing program for a variety of reasons. And it's pretty funny. There's a fair amount of literature out there talking about the relief that came with getting rid of the presidential fitness test. And so I put here, one poor soul who, basically was publicly shamed as I tried to do the sit and reach, which was part of the presidential fitness testing at one point. Okay, a couple of other things kind of cementing this connection between Roosevelt and sports. One thing that Roosevelt did do during his time as president that directly affected the development of sports in the United States was he intervened in the game of football. Football by 1905 was extremely popular, especially at the college level. There was no real pro game to speak of at this point, but it's also really dangerous. I won't get into the details here, but suffice it to say the motion rules that we're used to today, if you watch football, the idea basically that everybody lines up at the line of scrimmage, becomes stationary, and then they run into each other, those hadn't quite been figured out. And so you had these motion plays where, the offense would kind of get a huge running start and kind of descend on one poor defender or something like that. So by the time you get to 1905, there are hundreds of injuries annually and dozens of deaths. And so in 1905, actually, this issue reaches its crisis point. 19 or 20 college football players died that year, depending on who you ask. And there's a pretty strong movement against football, especially by some prominent university leaders, the most important of whom is Charles Eliot of Harvard. Now, Harvard University in 1905 isn't just Harvard academically, they are that. Harvard is also basically Alabama or Oklahoma or Texas in terms of football. Harvard is the football school. And so if Harvard's talking about getting rid of football because it's too dangerous, it has serious implications for the future as a game or as a whole. And so in this context, Roosevelt, whose son Ted Jr. you see here, who played at Harvard and is coming off the field after an injury, Roosevelt gets involved personally. And what he does in 1905 and into 1906 is he calls a series of meetings together, the first of which is at the White House, which calls for a reform movement in football. And basically what Roosevelt does, to make kind of a long story short, is he gives the White House approval to football as a whole. He says that he has no interest in abolishing a game just because it's dangerous, especially when it does, as he thinks it does, give so much in terms of character building. But Roosevelt, so he gives his support to the game, but also calls for kind of some changes to go forward. And so through Roosevelt's support, college football survives this abolition movement, and eventually the organization forms that becomes the NCAA. And so in this case, Roosevelt has a pretty direct influence here on sports in the United States. Now, as we wrap up here, I think it's fair to say, just give you kind of one counter example. Roosevelt is not supportive of one sport in particular at this time, and that is baseball. And in doing so, Roosevelt is basically ignoring what is the most popular sport in the country at the turn of the 20th century. And so I would just point this out because we should be aware of the fact that presidential influence is kind of a mysterious thing. So yes, Roosevelt is projecting this image of athleticism. He's supporting college football, the PSAL, the Olympics. And I think we can make the argument that his support matters there. But I just give you kind of this counterpoint because he's really against baseball. And he goes out of his way to snub baseball, but the game is still growing, as a whole. And so I would just point that out to kind of give us some context moving forward. Couple of other things. So, skip forward. Roosevelt is reelected to the presidency in 1904, or elected for the first time since he assumed it from McKinley. He promises he will not run again when he wins that 1904 election. And so Roosevelt moves out of the presidency at a pretty young age. He's just 50 years old when he leaves the presidency. And being out of the presidency is kind of difficult for Roosevelt. He famously says, in his final days in the White House that basically anyone who hears him say that he's relieved to be leaving the White House should understand that he's just saying that because he has to. Roosevelt loves the pressures of the White House. He loves the pomp and circumstance. He loves meeting people. He loves legislation, that process. But nevertheless, he leaves the White House in 1909. And then he has to kind of figure out what's next. And it's not a very smooth path going forward. He runs, as a third party candidate in 1912 and loses. He takes an amazing journey with his son down the Amazon, which almost kills him. But if you fast forward towards the tail end of his life, in 1917, Roosevelt's 58 years old. World War I is starting and he's been rejected. He wants to raise kind of another version of the Rough Riders. He's been turned away and told he can't do that. And so instead, Roosevelt in 1917 at 58 years old, and I'll kind of close with this story here, submits himself to a training camp. 58 years old at this point, Roosevelt's about 30 pounds overweight. He's always struggled to control his weight. And so he goes away to what at the time is called sometimes a fat farm or a health farm. And so he goes away to Jack Cooper's health farm. It's Connecticut in the fall, in October, with the idea that he's going to get himself back into fighting shape. And this is perhaps my favorite part of Roosevelt's story. Here you have a former president, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, author of some 40 books, all of these accomplishments, but at 58, he's still willing to kind of chase after physical fitness, still willing to chase after the strenuous life. And so for 2 weeks, he basically turns himself over to Jack Cooper. And from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, he goes through one exercise after another. Basically, he gets up and runs 3 or 4 miles, and then he does some medicine ball work, and then he spars in the gym, and then he's given a massage and a cold shower, and then kind of restarting the process after that. Over the course of 2 weeks, he loses about 15 pounds. And on the last day, he invites the press in to kind of hear about his experience. Roosevelt always loved attention. That was still part of the game at this point for him. But, on this day, he proudly shares that he's back in shape, that he believes their strong days are ahead. And he also really wants to show off this half-a-mile loop that he's been running and training over and over. And so he invites the press to come with him to see kind of this loop around a pond to experience what he's experienced. And this kind of what happens next, I think, kind of captures Roosevelt and the strenuous life. So he heads out, down this trail. Initially, he's walking at a leisurely pace, but it's not too long before he starts picking up the pace. Suddenly you've got, this core of the press, kind of spreading out behind him. And then Roosevelt decides to break into a jog. And at this point, you have the press, some of them can't keep up, some of them drop out, but there are a few people who think, I'm going to run this half mile with the president. Roosevelt steps it up. Finally, at the end, he's kind of broken away from everyone, and he, breaks through what would be the finish line if anybody knew that there were a race, and he exalts and is greeted, by everyone who's there as, wow, look at this strong, amazing athlete. Look at this 58-year-old man. What an example of the strenuous life. Roosevelt will, as you probably know, die not that long after this. Roosevelt passes away at age 60, just a couple of years later. But when he does so with the nation not ever really having seen him as an old man. So they're kind of left with this image of him as somebody who plays tennis in the White House and boxes in the White House, and even at 58 years old, is still racing people around the pond. And so Roosevelt's influence, I think, is not to be underestimated when we think today about what it means to chase after a strong physical life. And so I'll just end here by showing you that, as someone like Miley Cyrus has the strenuous life tattooed on her arm. The image that you see there in the middle is the Strenuous Life, which is a program, a physical fitness program, which you can buy into to be a part of. And then we still continue to use his words to kind of urge people towards exuberance and towards kind of strenuous living. And so I think this quest for the strenuous life, which Theodore Roosevelt articulated and demonstrated more than a century ago, continues to reverberate today. And so I'll leave it there, hopefully sharing a little bit. You've got a little idea for Roosevelt the athlete and Roosevelt with his athletic ideas and how he was a part of and a shaper of this athletic revolution that we are still experiencing today. So I think that's plenty. I would welcome any questions. I'll close end my, let's see, my sharing of the screen. Yeah, turn it back to you, Lenora.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was fascinating. And I'm not personally someone who's really very into sports or anything like that, but that was great. And I have to mention, if you're not familiar with Buffalo, you mentioned that your son's Little League field is right by the General Mills factory, and it smells like Captain Crunch. Buffalo is right near I believe it's General Mills factory. So the city often smells like Cheerios. So,
All right. Well, some commonalities there, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. One thing that as you were talking, and it's something that I've been thought about for quite a while, but never really had an opportunity to do any research, but it seems like a logical connection. I'd love to know if you could speak a little bit more about TR and the Olympics. It seems like a natural affinity, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So Roosevelt is supportive of the United States hosting the modern Olympic Games for the first time in 1904. And so he kind of signs on as an honorary president. But interestingly enough, Roosevelt doesn't buy into the idea of Pierre de Coubertin is the kind of father of the modern Olympics. And Coubertin's idea is that the Olympics will be a place really where athletes come together and demonstrate how common they are. And he has this kind of idealistic vision of the Olympics kind of making nations feel like they're more the same than different. And Roosevelt never kind of accepts that version of the Olympics. He very much sees it as a place for the US to demonstrate that it's men, and the Olympics is primarily men at the beginning, it's men are physically superior. And so he really embraces the idea of the Olympics as a place for America to win medals, to show that it's superior. And so I would say that Roosevelt's vision of the Olympics is somewhat nationalistic. And so that'll be kind of the tension that he has with the Olympic Games. He likes the idea of a venue to kind of show athletic competition and for the US to establish itself. But he's a little bit kind of leery of the idea that it's a place where, maybe athletes, there are some people early on in the Olympics who think that athletes shouldn't be separated by nation. Perhaps they should just kind of enter the field and not be marked by a particular uniform. Roosevelt doesn't buy into that vision. But during his presidency, he is the honorary president in 1904. And there's actually a 1906 Olympic Games too. It hasn't quite been decided. It's just going to be every 4 years. So he greets athletes after that, and again in 1908. So Roosevelt loves seeing American athletes go and win medals.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Then kind of with it might explain why I couldn't find too much more about. I expect there to be more in the surface of what what was going on.
Well, and I'll just add one other thing on the 1904 Olympics for Roosevelt. The timing is a bit unfortunate because he is running for president in 1904 for that election. And at that time, you really can't campaign openly. And so he is advised traveling to St. Louis for the games right as the election is about to happen would be kind of unseemly. And so he doesn't attend the Olympics. He does visit the World Fair after the election's over, but there is kind of that tension with that 1904 games.
Interesting. Let's see, I'm seeing one question. Of all sports, what was TR's favorite?
Personally, in terms of participation, boxing. Roosevelt, as a kid, like I mentioned, spars and takes boxing lessons and kind of sees that as key to becoming a man. At Harvard, he makes some of his best friends in the boxing gym. There's a famous story about Roosevelt kind of looking for the kind of Harvard men who will go and spar with him for several hours and then retire back to the dorms, if you will, and read some Tennyson. That's the kind of man he's looking for. It's a hard thing to find, even at Harvard. But so for him, boxing's important, and he will box, in the governor's mansion, at the White House. And he's actually blinded in a sparring match in 1906 in the White House. And that ends his boxing kind of exercising career. But so in terms of participation, it's boxing. That's his favorite. In terms of watching, I would say college football is probably his favorite. He attends many football games during his life and is a fan of that game, even though he didn't have much experience playing it himself.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm going to have to look up that video footage about the Army-Navy game right after he becomes president.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm just trying to let's see if we have any other questions. So do you think that you point out that the TR is part of this popularization of athletics in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Do you think that popularization would have been substantially different if, say, I'm thinking about Taft succeeding TR, and he certainly doesn't, I think he played golf, but he certainly doesn't seem to be the athletic type that TR was, do you think it would have slowed things down, or how do you think that might have impacted that development?
Yeah, it's a fair question. It's a good question. I think the tricky thing with this kind of project is giving Roosevelt credit for being in the right place at the right time, having a lot of ideas. I mean, one thing that Roosevelt does, unlike really any president, I mean, he has so much to say about so many things. He writes 150,000 letters during his lifetime. He gives so many speeches that he talks about athletics more than any other president, because he talks about everything more than every other president. So I mean, that's part of it. And so so I think Roosevelt, because of who he is and because of the time, has an opportunity that he seizes. Because of his story with asthma, he sees sports as kind of important and as an answer to a question. And so I think it's fair to say that Roosevelt serves to really push sports forward, to legitimize them as not just a pastime for children, not just as a waste of time, but as something that can fit kind of in the modern American life, which is still very much kind of in question at this time. So I think we're right to give Roosevelt credit for that. But I don't think we can argue that without Roosevelt, we wouldn't have sports or something like that. I think he played a role in legitimizing them and kind of shaping them. I think he plays a role in connecting them to our national identity. And I think, had Taft been in place during those 8 years, it would have looked a little bit different. Taft, one of the first things he does, in taking the White House is he bulldozes that tennis court, which had become so famous, and he puts a greenhouse on it, and then he plays golf. And so Roosevelt, for a nation that was concerned about how to find fitness and vigorous living in the midst of this increasingly mechanized space, Roosevelt really meets a need. And so I think he's important in terms of shaping the narrative from this point. And, the organizations that he supports, the PSAL, kind of interscholastic sports, the Olympics, kind of all these things that come up, the NCAA, are still really important today. So, you kind of see that moving forward. And so that's the fence I would sit on in terms of answering your question.
Yeah, I realize it's those kind of shaded, the shades of things.
Yeah.
Incidentally, I remember those presidential fitness awards from my childhood. I had no idea that there was, a derivative from TR.
Yeah, or at least his time. I think Roosevelt, they initially developed a badge system. So if you ran the 60-yard dash in this much, you got a badge. If you could jump this far in the broad jump, you got a badge. And so then that, kind of morphs from New York City, as often is the case, out to New York, out to the rest of the country. And then there's various versions of it, becomes the presidential fitness, system, which I think terrorized a lot of kids. Apparently there's all kinds of literature about when Obama ends it, that is, people are like, whew, my kids won't be subjected to that. So kind of interesting.
Huh. Yeah. Let's see, I don't see any other questions, but feel free to type them in the chat if you have them. Do you feel you've exhausted the vein of research between TR and athletics, or are you working on something else that connects?
I think there's always more to say about TR. I mean, he's such so much writing, so many ideas. But I think I was pleased to be able to spend several years on this topic and to really kind of dig into this. One thing that, I mentioned that I had kind of this personal question that, was in some ways centered around my own experiences and what I saw with my kids. But other authors have touched on bits of this story too. So I felt like someone needed to come and kind of focus on this entirely. And so I was pleased to be able to do that and kind of bring these things together and really dig into these records. And so I would say that for me, I'm going to kind of hold on to Teddy Roosevelt. It was difficult in studying him not to be enamored with some of the amazing things that he did. I will say, so I had the privilege of reading through his letters, and he can really make you feel bad about yourself as a father, as a speaker, because he writes these letters as he's president to his kids, and he is so eloquent. And so he's an amazing subject. I think there will continue to be books and interests about TR, but I feel, that I'm pretty satisfied or sated at this point in terms of my digging into Roosevelt and sports as a focus.
Great. Well, I certainly appreciate your perspective, and it's given me certainly quite a bit of food for thought, and I'm sure our audience feels the same way. If I don't see any other questions, but we certainly appreciate your time and your expertise. And thank you so much for joining us all the way from New Mexico. I guess this is one of the wonderful bits about Zoom, being able to connect with scholars such as yourself, and being able to hear your perspective and all of your good work.
It was absolutely my pleasure, and thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everyone who's joining us. I think we're going to say good night for now. And our next speaker night, I believe, is October 26th, if I'm not mistaken. It's the fourth Tuesday, and will be actually Mark Lozo, the TR site's own education director, is going to be talking about what is now the TR site's role in the Patriots War. So it ought to be an interesting talk. Thanks again, Ryan. Thank you, Travis, for helping behind the scenes, and good night, everyone.